Welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. This is your host, Elon 11, and this is a comics podcast. This is a comics podcast for people who know that the magic we see on the pages and on screen are made by artists, most of whom are freelance. And boy, does the alleged COVID relief package not address their needs adequately. You can make a difference by contacting groups like the Freelancers Union, who have really excellent resources on policy measures that they're pushing for that will help people in the comics industry, but all freelance workers everywhere. So go to freelancersunion.org and consider like how we're going to be making sure that people who are not covered by the so-called COVID relief bill are actually getting the support they need. And that includes people like the delivery workers who are bringing you your food. Any immigrants who are in it, even people who are documented, are being prevented from getting the money that they deserve, despite the fact that they're keeping the whole country functioning at all to the level that it is. We really can't afford to leave people behind right now. So if you also are looking for other ways to get involved in your community, considering mutual aid organizations, and you can always tweet me, ELANA_Brooklyn. That's ELANA_Brooklyn. I know a lot of folks organizing around the country, but I wanted to keep the perspectives and needs of freelance artists and creators on the top of our minds right now. As we go into our conversation today, I have an interview with somebody who I'm extremely excited to be speaking to, someone whose work I've admired for a long time, and I'm still a little bit nerdy and nervous to be interviewing. I'm being joined by Jerry Ordway. Jerry got his first professional comics work in the summer of 1980. In the years since, he's written and drawn the adventures of countless iconic characters such as Superman, Captain Marvel, the Justice Society, All-Star Squadron, the Avengers, and the Fantastic Four. As an inker, he worked on Crisis on Infinite Earths, as well as Zero Hour for DC Comics. In the 90s, Jerry co-created and drew the Wild Star for Image Comics, wrote and drew his own creation, The Messenger. Also in the 90s, his award-winning hardcover graphic novel, The Power of Shazam, retold the origin of Captain Marvel, which spun into a long-running monthly series featuring painted covers and writing by Jerry, with art by penciler Peter Krause and inker Mike Manley. In recent years, he has started self-publishing his comic Proton. Last year, Jerry reunited with his All-Star Squadron collaborator Roy Thomas for an 80th anniversary Captain America story for Marvel Comics, followed by this year, Submariner story written by Alan Brennett as art of the celebration, part of the celebration of Marvel's 25th anniversary. Next up, work on the launch of Dark Horse's comic adaptation of Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I just like, it's impossible for me to not say Crisis on Infinite Earths and like imagine that there's a lot of echo. Your work has been a part of so many huge moments in the comics industry. So I'm just really excited and grateful to have you joining us.
Oh, thank you.
So tell me, how did you get started as an artist? And how did you get into comics as a lover or enjoyer of the medium in the first place?
Well, I think most kids draw when they're little. And, it's a way to, if you have kids, you know that you can hand them paper and crayons or whatever and it'll occupy them. So I think I was certainly given paper and crayons. And I think I really liked just drawing in itself. But once I found comic books, I think I kind of fell in love with the idea of telling stories on paper. I mean, rather than just doing pictures. And that's really where it started. And I think I discovering Marvel Comics when I was 10 years old. I'd read some DC stuff earlier, but the Marvel Comics they just felt like they were my generation's comics, and the DCs all felt like something that pre-existed me in a way. And I guess that was me already being snobby as a 10-year-old. But I grew up in that era with the Batman TV show, which I remember watching very excitedly, watching it when it debuted in 1966. So there's a lot of stuff like that I was very, I think, influenced by. And as a kid, when you're drawing, you're looking for some sort of, I don't know, a pat on the head or whatever. And I definitely had a good support group. My mom and my aunt were very supportive, and I think they felt that just getting that kind of little recognition for doing a drawing or for making a homemade comic or whatever always felt kind of special, you know. I mean, you really get no. I don't think you have a better your lifetime fan really is your mom or your family. So I think that's what really fueled it. Really, as a you start as a kid and then you get to a point where you think I have to get a regular job. How can I ever do comics? So I got a job as a typesetter back in the late 70s, right out of high school, and I did that for a couple of years, and then I segued from that into an art studio where I ran the camera department because I'd had some expertise by that point running stat machines and shooting film and things like that. So at the art studio, I tried to learn how to become an illustrator, and I wound up coming back to comics because I think they saw that was my strong suit, and the people that ran the studio then got work. They had done some work for Western Publishing. Western did it was the Golden Books, coloring books, and these magic frame, uh, like drawing trace things that you I don't know if anybody really have to be old, but you remember they used to.
I remember this like as a general concept. Yes.
They were like in a plastic sheet, and then underneath was kind of a waxy kind of thing. So you'd take the stylus and you could draw, and then you'd pull the sheet up and it would disappear. So you could keep drawing and erasing, so to speak. So these were like their mainstay. They sold these things, pretty cheap. But I wound up drawing a DC Comics superheroes activity and coloring book, and then I wound up doing a 4-part Marvel Comics activity coloring book. It was like everyday workbooks. They were written by educators, and you tried to work around that to make them exciting. But that first DC thing is what actually got me to. I got the attention of DC, though I didn't know it. I had tried to get work at DC. I had gone from Wisconsin, where I was born. Drove to New York during the summer of, I think, 77, and got turned down, went back, stayed with my commercial art, wound up working on the coloring books. And then in 1980, the summer of 80, DC Comics had an official talent search, and editor Joe Orlando was conducting it at the Chicago Con. So I brought samples from my coloring book stuff. I brought those samples because they were the most current, and I waited in this long hallway for most of the day, from about 10 in the morning till it was about 5, I think, by the time I got seen. And I just kept looking, watching Joe Orlando, and from a distance, moving up one more person, because he spent time with everybody. He was really good. And meanwhile, while he's doing this, Paul Levitz kept coming up to him, because Paul was Joe's assistant. Paul kept coming up to Joe, and he'd say, "Joe, you haven't taken a break. Let's take a break. You need to knock, we can stop. You can do this tomorrow." And Joe said, "No, I'm going to take care of everybody. I want to, get everybody in the room." So finally my turn. I get up there, I show him my samples from the coloring book, and they were like crazy stuff, like Wonder Woman without the stars on her pants. Instead, the stars were in the sky, so the kid was supposed to find Wonder Woman's stars. He's looking at this drawing, and he is punchy. He doesn't know what he's like, wait, why is Wonder Woman, why doesn't she have any stars? What's going on? What's going on? And I'm thinking, this isn't going to go well. And then Paul Levitz comes by yet again to say, "Joe, we're going to go to dinner." And he looks down and he goes, "Oh, Jerry Ordway, we've been trying to get in touch with you." And I'm like, what?
Wow.
So I spent this whole day in a hot, sweaty room, hallway. And then Paul, immediately saw my name on the piece and goes, because I was working through an art studio, so I wasn't like a freelancer. So they had no way of contacting me. The contact for them, they had approved all the drawings I'd done. So they were aware of it. Yeah. So that started, I think, a week after that Chicago Con. I got my first, inking job in the mail to ink a Carmine Infantino story. And, it was like, oh my God, I think I'm in comics.
That's amazing. And, you telling me about the coloring book, like I remember the sorts of activity books that you would get. Yeah. and how confusing it would be to be looking at one and not understanding that that's what that was the activity for. How
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, I still have
One of
the
the, yeah.
artwork too, which is funny. I've
Oh,
looked at
wow.
every so often. I'll go through the basement and have some because these were like 16 by 20, really large. Um, and I have some of these pieces, and I'll look at them and I go, wow, those I could see why someone would be confused because they all told a story. But as I said, they were written by educators who didn't know anything about comics. So you'd always try to save it somehow or make it make some kind of sense because
Right.
I was a comic fan and I thought, wow, this is really stupid.
Well, you're right to like focus on the storytelling piece of it. Like that's what kids get drawn to too. I have to remember, I don't know if the year would work out. Do you remember, have you seen the meme of like Lex Luthor stole 70 pies? Like there's a page from a
Oh,
DC activity book that is like became a famous viral meme on the internet.
that's funny. I wonder if that's in there because I think there is a page like that in the coloring book I did or the activity book. That's
I'm going to
funny.
send this to you. You might be behind this huge internet meme about counting that is like so many layers removed from its source that it's data at this
That
point.
is funny. Yeah, I did the like I remember drawing a Lex Luthor one and it had something to do with counting. But I think there was another guy who worked at this art studio who did the kind of like a cartoony. He did a lot of objects and things like that in the book. Where if it was pies or whatever, he would draw kind of a cartoony pie, and then they would stat it, or that type of thing, a star or a sun or whatever. It was always kind of a way to because I was drawing a little more realistically or more comic style. So I think for the age group that they were aiming this at, they wanted something that was almost, like well, it had to be very identifiable. So to draw a sun, it was a sun that we would all use, maybe even now as an avatar or something.
Mm.
It was that very simple but more graphic kind of um, thing. But yeah, I did a bunch of puzzles. I also did, a couple of toy things like GoBots. I did some full
Oh my
color
gosh.
puzzles. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then you also were involved in some fanzine stuff
Oh
as
yeah,
well.
from about the early, well, I'd say about 1974, I started doing fan stuff, and it was all through the mail at the time. It was, I mean, nobody can appreciate how wonderful it is to send somebody an email to go. I mean, now it's, you can go on Twitter, you can do all this, but back then it was all either you had to know somebody or you had to find you know, a fanzine, and fanzines were usually done as, people no, nobody did them on schedule. So you could even, you could write or do an ad, take an ad out in the Comic Buyer's Guide or one of these places and say, send in for my fanzine. And a lot of times I would send, you'd tape like 30 cents to a piece of paper in an envelope and mail change. And then you would never get it. And you'd think, wow, what's going on? And like a year later, something would show up and you had already forgotten about your investment of 30 cents or whatever. But
I guess in some ways that's like when you join a Patreon and they don't update for a while and
uh,
then suddenly they do and you're like, oh, free podcast. I
yeah,
mean,
I
not
keep
free,
hearing
but
about, I mean, I've talked to different people about Patreon, and I feel kind of almost like it would be too much pressure, because I don't like I hate to owe things.
Mm,
I like if I do commissions, I always tell somebody when to, okay, I'll take payment up front, but I will tell them,
mhm.
exactly when I'm ready to start, because if you get paid for something and you take 5 months, by the time you do it, you feel like you're doing it free, even though you aren't. You know what I
Right,
mean?
right.
Because you're not going to get a paycheck for it because you already got it or whatever. So I just I think a Patreon would feel like almost too much to manage. you know.
But I believe you were part of a successful Kickstarter that became a graphic novel.
hmm
So I Semiautomagic, which actually came to me when I was talking to Alex di Campi like
hmm
a long time ago. And I was so excited because I just love this combination of like your art and her writing together was such a cool thing.
Yeah.
So I guess it's who's the publisher on this? Dark Horse, right?
Well, they published it in Dark Horse Presents, and then we did a Kickstarter with a entirely new story. It was like I think the Kickstarter had, I want to say 50 pages of new material.
Oh, okay.
So the only thing that's available now, I think, for sale is still Dark Horse as the initial the first story arc. But yeah, it was
Oh,
fun, and what was fun about it for me, again, I having been in comics for ages and ages, I told Alex, I said, I got to tell you, this is after having drawn comics for over 30 years, it's actually going to be 40 years, which is scary. So I was thinking about that. 1980 is when I started, so this summer will be 40. But what's scary about it, what was interesting was I told her, I said, all these times I've drawn, all the comics I've drawn, I've never encountered more things that I've never drawn before than I have in her script. And it was cool.
I mean, you hadn't drawn airbags from an airplane growing teeth and trying to eat people in a
Right,
nightmare,
right.
because who could say no? I really enjoyed that comic, and I just love the comic. I mean, it's an intergenerational
Yeah,
comic, right? And I think that that's really special to have two people from different generations
yeah.
working together
Well,
on a
she's got, I
creator-owned
mean, she
piece.
also had I never really did a lot of horror stuff. And I think she's got like a really good, uh, she definitely knows what is scary and what's not scary. I'm not somebody, I like reading horror and I like all that, but I'm not somebody who you would choose to draw a horror book. So I think that works, because it's kind of an unexpected, and again, for me, it was fun because it's the type of thing I hadn't drawn much of. So
Mm.
um, I enjoyed that.
What's interesting also, like when I think of your work, I think a lot, and this is another funny thing, is you were talking about how you really related to Marvel the most as a young person, is you've done so much DC in general, and a lot of it also, particularly of DC characters that
Hmm.
were retro at the time you were writing them, like they
Yeah,
were already retro.
yeah,
And it's something that you've talked about in the text of your comics when in your Shazam Powers of Shazam series,
hmm,
like being retro and nostalgia is part of the themes that you're looking at as well.
yeah.
So I thought that was interesting to hear. You're like, oh, this other thing is old. So when did that change for you? Did you start to have different feelings about like art that is drawing on older aesthetics or is about themes of nostalgia or the past?
I think back on when I grew up, it was, most like my early childhood obviously was in the 60s, but probably remember the 70s mostly. But
Yeah.
my mother had a tavern, and we lived in the back of the tavern. So she was, divorced, single mom, basically raising a couple of kids. And we were there, so we lived kind of at home, but through that kitchen door there was the tavern. So the tavern was part of our upbringing. And the guys that it was mostly men, there were a couple of women, but mostly old retired guys who'd been in World War One. You know, some guys who were World War II were the younger guys back then.
Mm.
But these people all had a 19 really a lot of 1930s vernacular. I mean, it was kind of Damon Runyon-esque, the tavern itself. So
Yeah.
that kind of implanted, I think, and in my sensibilities. And I think when I got to the first comic thing, of course, the first series I wound up doing regularly was All Star Squadron, which was
Hmm.
set in 1940, 41 or whatever. December 7th is the start of the series. So I do feel like I was typecast to a degree by that, but at the same time, I'm very comfortable with it because I do like history. I'm a big fan of reading about eras past, and I think I love detective fiction from the 30s, from the 40s. I mean, big Raymond.
Same.
I love Raymond Chandler. I love Dashiell
Yeah.
Hammett. I love. I mean, I've branched out and tried to find other stuff from like James M. Cain and stuff, and I that's the stuff that I really enjoy as far as privately. Um, so I guess it's the fact that another thing that changes. I guess it's different if you're like if when I first started drawing comics before I got into comics, but when I did my fanzine, I did it when I was in high school. I did 2 issues of
Hmm.
OK Comics, and by the second issue, I had connected with another artist in Milwaukee, Mike Macklin, and Mike I was 17. I think Mike was 25, and it was like almost like an older brother kind of thing because Mike knew more about the 1950s comics. He also liked the 1940s comics. So
Hmm.
I think by virtue of having a friendship with him at that time, I was also exposed to like the Black Terror and the Simon and Kirby stuff from the 40s because Mike was a
Yeah.
really big fan of that. So I think, a lot of our life experiences kind of lead us in a certain way. I just read something. They said, like, we all know this anyways, but like when you're, say, 10 or 11, the pop culture that you get immersed in tends to kind of dictate your tastes in a way too when you're
Hmm.
so I think having all those different life experiences kind of molds you in a way that makes it some of these things inevitable. You can fight them, but that's where you're going anyways.
Yeah. No, I just think it's so interesting because it's like, like in the 80s and the 90s, like, JSA All-Star Squadron, that's like the 80s and 90s doing retro stuff from World War
Right,
II.
right.
I was reading your blackout, whiteout um, issues that of Justice Society of America comic,
Hmm.
and I was struck at how you're like, yeah, we're going to talk about World War II because that's what you should do. Like, what makes those characters special? To me, well, for me, like, I've always just thought that those particular characters had interesting aesthetics, designs to their costumes.
Hmm.
But I never really was like, well, what's interesting that they have to say per se? And you kind of pointed out, like, oh, well, what's interesting is that their commentary on World War II, because that's like what they're there to be.
Right,
That made a lot of sense to me.
right. Well, those characters that I always felt strongly about again, Roy Thomas is the guy who introduced me to All Star Squadron and a whole bunch of
Hmm.
characters I didn't know. And I really enjoyed the fact that there's so many pockets of comic history that didn't survive because the companies went on, either they went away or the character was so obscure that never got used again after 1945 or something. There's a bunch of things like that that are fascinating to me. Um, but when you have the JSA, for example, I always felt like the JSA, you don't have to worry about Batman and Superman, like Golden Age. Oh, do they exist? The whole thing about Crisis trying to streamline everything. Well, the big thing about the JSA wasn't the fact that Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman were part of it. It was the fact that it was anchored to a specific time, not only the beginning of comics, but also World War II. So you have similar to Captain America, and Marvel, obviously figured out a way to make Captain America the man out of time and stuff. But to me, JSA has always been about that history. So if you're going to do a story, you have that all that history to play with, and that I think makes it more interesting than something that just doesn't have that. Like it would be like talking to uh, an elderly person who has experiences that you maybe only read about. You know, like in our
Hmm.
time, like where we're dealing with right now, you think about how extraordinary the circumstances are that it's worldwide, the
Yeah.
viral stuff. But, there's really nothing we can compare to in even my lifetime, you
Yeah.
know. So you think about people in World War II where they actually had to sacrifice food. They had to grow, victory gardens and things like that. And they had rationing for food and gasoline so that, the soldiers could have gasoline and soldiers could have, you know what I mean? There's a
Yeah.
sacrifice element that we have less of a connection to, than they did. And again, so if you're talking to somebody from that era, that's gold. That's what I want to hear. What was
Right.
it like to live through that? Or what was it like to, experience this or that? So that's to me what the JSA offer. And they should always be linked to World War II anyways. But and you can work out any kind of science fictiony story element to explain well they're still why they're still around, why they're not
Hmm.
mummies or something. But uh,
I
but
agree.
but
Yeah.
that's what makes them interesting. And every character is like that. I mean, you have to find a core interest level. Like how was Dr. Fate in when he was first created, or how was Green Lantern? They all had like a basic concept that you can always go back to and find something that relates to today. You know, the best relaunches of any of those characters always go back to the basics, and they don't always reinvent everything, but they'll find something that speaks to today or to whatever
Mhm.
the time they're reinventing it,
Well, you're the guy who made Shazam a thing, I think, for people of my generation.
Hmm.
I'm curious, like, I I think that in my head, Shazam was just sort of like, he's like a Superman, but who has stylized eyebrows because that's how he was originally drawn.
Right.
And I was like very excited that there was a physical tell for him because
Yeah,
I think characters should have that more as a stylistic note. But
absolutely.
it's apparently not just that. Like, how did you become a fan of Shazam, and like why has that spoken to you so much?
Well, I'm lucky in a way that I think sometimes if you grow up with something and it's your favorite thing ever, that you can't really do it because you don't have a way of telling if you're good or bad. Like if you love
Mm,
something too much. So in the case of Superman and Shazam, I wasn't a DC reader. I didn't read Superman until maybe the 80s. Like
hmm.
when Gil Kane, because like Gil Kane was a favorite of mine. I like Kurt Swan, but I just wasn't into those books. So
Right.
for me, with Shazam, it was the same thing. I really wasn't someone who was waiting anxiously for the chance to do it. It was that I found a way to do it, and the guy who got me hooked on it was the same editor that I worked with on the Batman movie adaptation, was Jonathan Peterson. He and I
Hmm.
started talking about it, and we found a way into it that felt like it would work, for that time. But again, it comes down to the concept. I look at the original concept, and we're talking 80s. The original concept is very dark. It's about a boy who's living on the street selling newspapers, who follows a stranger into a subway tunnel. I mean, there's elements in there that are so dark. They're not
Yeah.
that different from, how does someone like that basically come out of it optimistic and smiling? So that's what makes him different from Superman, and that's what makes him different from Batman and any other characters. You find that, with Billy Batson, he lost his family, and he's basically, it explains the entire premise of the Shazam family, or the Marvel family, was that he was trying to recreate his family, and that was the hook. And the other hook for me was that around that time that I was doing it, my wife and I had our first child, and then by the time the regular monthly series was out, I had my first son in '95. So I mean, that all informs, your approach. So by the time I was doing the regular Shazam comic and I reintroduced Mary Marvel, I
Hmm.
had a daughter who really didn't have much comic wise beyond Archie comics in that era. It was all bad girl art and highly sexualized, high heeled, leather wearing females who were
Right. Right.
just eye candy. So, that was something that I don't know that I would have had that same perspective had I not had a daughter, and
Hmm.
seen how slim the pickings were for her if I wanted her to enjoy comics like I did, because I tried to push comics on all my kids, and they all responded, you know, to a degree, but Rachel's the only one who really took up and started drawing and writing her own stuff. So,
Oh wow.
but yeah, at the time, I felt it was very painful. Like we would be watching the cartoon shows, and you had, you know, the Batman show had various characters and stuff, but you had Catwoman, but then they introduced, Batgirl, and then they did the Superman show and they introduced Supergirl. So there were finally kind of at least on TV, there were characters that were
Hmm.
kind of good role models for, fiction wise for her, but those didn't exist in comics. So that era, is the Punisher era and the Lobo era and
Yeah.
the big gun era and stuff. So we were, when I did the regular comic, I knew the main thing was we were swimming against the tide.
Well,
There
you
was
also, yeah.
nobody doing Smiling Heroes, and I think it, while it was being published, it was kind of underestimated because of that, because it was kind of lighthearted, even though we did dramatic stories, it still had a optimistic, you know, I
Hmm.
just never wanted to pander to that. I felt like it would have been a violation of that character's premise, to make him dark and broody and everything else.
Well, the result is, I think you have a series that's very timeless, and a lot of those things that like were the trend at the time are very much like, oh man, that's so 90s.
Right.
And it's almost looked at as like I almost like people like it ironically at this
Yeah.
point. I came of age of like that was my era of comics that I began just
Hmm.
because of the chronology of my life. But I didn't like the aesthetics of that time at all.
Yeah.
It didn't speak to me. And something about this more traditional style, I just found it to be more elegant,
Hmm.
and it still works. Like, I
Well,
don't
you know what?
know.
You know what's funny is this is a lesson in, again, it's a lesson in when you're reading comics like I did when I was a kid. One of the comics that always stood up, and it's kind of funny now to think about it, but I was a big Avengers fan,
Hmm.
and I told this story maybe before, but there's an issue of the Avengers where Hawkeye and Captain America, the entire group shows up, at the bad guys, whatever their location, and one of the bad guys says the Avengers, and Hawkeye says you were expecting maybe the Strawberry Alarm Clock,
Ooh,
which
I love
was
it.
a 1960, I'd say probably like
Yeah.
67, 68
Hmm.
one hit wonder. They did Incense and Peppermints, you know.
Yeah.
But I remember as a kid reading that and going, "Oh wow, they just referenced the current band." The danger of that is, of course, that 5 years later, no one, if that's reprinted, no one knows who the hell, Strawberry Alarm Clock are. So,
I do.
but I always took that as a lesson though, and that's why, like
Mm.
when I was writing stuff, when I was writing Superman or whatever, I'd always think, and I talked to Mike Carlin with Superman, we'd just chat about stuff. It's like, can you use this slang? How long? How much? How many
Hmm.
years will this slang be understandable? Or, like it's better to be a little bit more generic in your slang than to try to be so on point for whatever's happening at that moment that it winds up looking stupid a year later. So I've always tried to think of that when I've written stuff, is just, does it need to be like, oh my God, that's just what I heard on the street today? It really
Hmm.
doesn't. I mean, you could still watch an old movie and not feel like it's in another language. So
Hmm.
I think that Roy Thomas one though, with this Incense and Peppermint, just that just cracked me up. The Strawberry Alarm Clock, that became kind of like
Yeah.
the thing not to do, even though I liked it when I was 11 years old or whatever.
Hmm.
And
Well, yeah.
Shazam was always supposed to be, that was the other hook that we came up with, was the idea that Shazam was really that place, that time, hasn't changed. It's that small town feel. It was a Midwestern ethic. That's where I grew up, in the Midwest, and there were certainly places that were like that, even where everybody's friendly, and it has kind of like that. Wow, this is the 1950s, or is it? So
And you addressed it in the story in an interesting way, which I
yeah,
thought was really cool.
yeah. Shazam basically puts the city in amber in a way. He kind of slows down time or what have you. But
And then you have him, you're the guy who had him break out and like wear some normal clothing.
mhm.
And I totally, but speaking of like indie comics, but also time capsules, you had one of the doctors be like, "What is it, Mr. Natural?" And I was like, okay. Like, which for folks who don't know is a character from Robert Crumb from the indie comics from the 60s. But like I love that stuff too though, but I'm
I
a big
think
nerd
what's
about those
funny
things.
is
Yeah.
I think that joke came from Roger Stern, and that's what's funny, because for some reason I remember that coming up, and it was like I want to give him credit for that, because it was just like funny. I was thinking of, like, you always had the guy in the kind of almost the cartoon guy with the end is near sign, and he
Hmm.
looked like some kind of, you know, like somebody in a robe, or somebody with the long beard and the long hair or whatever. And I think Roger Stern threw that my way, which, so I'll give him credit, even if it's not, but I think it was him. Because that's the fun part about, having a comic community in a way.
Hmm.
And I kind of missed that in the pretty much the last 20 years. But when in the 90s, all the Superman guys, I mean, I would still see everybody, and we were good friends. So we'd see each other at shows or in the office or something. You just would pick up where you left off. And that's the unfortunate part of, really, the big thing was DC moving to California. It lost that kind of, I guess, that connection in a way to the just casually going up and seeing who's new and, looking at artwork that's coming in or what have you. Now I'm back to, looking on the internet, seeing new artists and picking up new comics at the comic store and seeing, new people. And, it's anybody you ever, like, you hear people complaining all the time about comics. Oh, they're terrible. And, a lot of people message me and appeal to me in the way of like, yes, that's the way comics, should be and everything. And I say, well, that's the way we did it, and it's a classic style. But I think there's tons of good stuff. Always, there's always going to be
Yeah.
tons of good stuff, and to not have it be exactly as you remember it from 1985 or whatever. I understand that nostalgic appeal, but by the same token, if you love art and you love story, there's tons of stuff to find. There's plenty of books every week that I find, that I buy. So I think that's like one of those unfortunate kind of arguments that comes out of people being nostalgic, but yet at the same time, maybe trying to find an excuse for why they're not buying comics, or maybe they're, excuse for why they're not as into the hobby as they used to be or whatever.
Or sometimes they're hostile to people who they think of as being new or different from
Yeah,
them. And
there's that too. I mean, there's but like Twitter, which you're on, I'm on. Twitter is like all the bad letters that people wrote to the letters to the editor column that never got printed because they were just cranky,
yeah,
And
I
now
hear you, but
now you have a venue for it. No one can say, well, we're not going to print that. But they did
right,
in
it's
the
there
old days.
anyway.
They would say, yeah, that one's not going to get printed.
Although I'll tell you, God, this will get me banned on the internet. I read lots of older comics, and I often read the letters, including the ones from like my own, time of when I began reading comics. And there's some comics that are famous for having excellent letter sections that like live and die by it too. But overall, I think sometimes they choose the letters from like the dumbest people. Like they're just not very articulate. It sounds like maybe it's because they're all written by 10-year-olds, and that's fine because it's
Yeah.
10-year-olds. You know what I mean? But
Well, I think
I'm like,
you know
I
what
don't know,
it was.
guys.
It was here's something like the letter columns paid. I want to say they paid 50 or $75. So that was like freelance work. If you were an assistant editor, you'd
Oh,
often get to write the letter column. And, it was something you did in an evening, for
oh
example.
wow.
So
Okay.
you'd take the letters, and some books got 50 letters a month. Some books didn't,
Right.
but the books that got 40 letters a month, you could pick and choose. In other words, like if you're on maybe a lesser selling book or something that just wasn't as, you know, much fan interest, you might get like 10 letters. So your choices are limited, but you're also limited whoever wound up writing it. Again, nobody probably trains anybody. You just do it instinctually. Like Mike Carlin had rules, and for a short period of time on Superman, I wrote the letter columns,
Oh
and I didn't
wow.
do it because I wanted the $75. It was because I felt like, oh, I'm writing and drawing the book. I'd like to have this connection. So I would I'm sorry for the alerts I'm getting.
No, I couldn't hear it, so you're
Oh,
good.
okay. But so I did them for a period, I think when I was doing Adventures of Superman,
Hmm.
when I was first writing and drawing it. And it's harder than you think because, there's a formula for it. And again, it's not that you pick the most boring letter. You don't want to pick something that's nasty because
Hmm.
basically it's not constructive criticism. But you'll pick stuff that somebody will say, "Hey, I didn't like this, or you did this wrong." I'm happy to print that, and thank them for correcting me on something because, there's always going to be an expert on one specific thing in your audience. You're always going
Hmm.
to find that. But
Hmm.
but like I said, a lot of the assistant editors would do it just for for the extra money. And I, again, I don't know, like some editors are better than other editors, and some editors connect more with the audience than others. And those are the ones that people tend to remember. I guess that's the best way
Yeah.
of explaining. I think those people tended to have the better letter pages because they actually did, you know, treat the letters with some respect.
As a community building space.
Yeah.
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 Well, you've had a lot of different jobs in the comics industry, and I realized like I don't feel like I've ever had a really in-depth conversation with someone with a strong who's been an inker. I mean, certainly nobody who's inked Crisis before, but just generally speaking, like I've had artists on who do some inking, but you're
Mhm.
someone who just done a ton of inking,
Yeah,
and I'd love to hear your thoughts about like you began by doing your illustrations there. You were doing both pieces, and then when you came on DC, you were doing a lot of inking, and you've continued to just do this amazing inking
yeah,
work. What 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 is it? What was it like shifting to doing the inking role? And then you got to tell me at least a little bit about inking on Crisis because that is one of
sure.
the biggest
Well,
comics that ever
the
happened.
first thing is I like the technical aspect of inking.
Hmm.
Um, there's something that appealed to me visually when I read comics. I was thrilled to see Joe Sinnott's name and Wally Wood and Tom Palmer and Klaus Janson. I mean,
Oh
those are
yeah.
just a couple of names, but those guys did a lot of inking on multiple styles, and they always had a,
Hmm.
you know, their work showed through. Sometimes it overpowered, but most times it was, in a nice complimentary way. But it's a technical job, and
Hmm.
a good inker should also know how to draw because you're interpreting somebody else's, you know, chicken scratching, and you have to know what to do with it. And so I always liked that technical aspect of it that appealed to me. But when I first got to DC, I would love to have been a penciler right away because that's what I was trying for. And Paul Levitt said, "I think you're more of a finisher, and we need finishers more than we need pencilers." Because they
Hmm.
had a lot of guys who did layouts, or they had people who did kind of. It was a transition period. You have to, I think, when you're looking back on 1980, were maybe a couple years into people like P. Craig Russell and Mike Zeck and you know Howard Chaykin and stuff. People who were putting more work into the pages than the previous generation, because the previous generation were they were the professionals who had a certain amount of work that they did to maintain an income, whereas the
Hmm.
young guys could spend 8 hours on a page, you know, and make it as good as possible. So there was a transition there. So I was inking initially. I inked a bunch of short story things over people who did kind of more rough, less detailed pencils, and
Hmm.
I added stuff to it. So I guess that became suddenly, oh, he's good. He's going to be able to enhance this. So when I did worked on Rich Buckler, I was adding to it. I wasn't just following lines. I was actually being paid a little extra to do more detail and lighting and things. But that's the difference between just inking and finishing.
Right.
So you basically got a less complete pencil drawing. Maybe it didn't have any shading in it. Maybe it didn't have any light source, any of that. So, but I enjoyed that because it was kind of like more like penciling because I was actually just doing a little drawing with ink. So I did
Hmm.
that and I kind of got stuck because I was good at it. They liked it. So it was hard to break out of it. So
Right.
I had actually was working on All Star Squadron. Rich Buckler left after 4 or 5 issues, maybe five, and then a new guy came on. And the new guy was decent, but he was very generic, and it was really my style that was carrying it over because I had done the first bunch of issues. So I became kind of more I was doing a lot of work, and I felt kind of like people see Inker and they don't really know what he does, or they think you're just tracing or whatever. So it's like it's a weird thing. So you want to have some kind of feeling of contributing, and you want to be acknowledged for it, but just by virtue of that credit, you don't get people don't know what it is, so therefore they don't know what you're doing. So
Right.
I wound up saying I would love to do penciling. I kept asking Len Wein, who was my editor. I said I'd really love to do penciling, and it never happened. I sent him penciling samples. He liked them, but it just wasn't going to happen because they didn't want to upset the apple cart. Everything was going fine. They didn't want to lose me on All Star Squadron. So finally, I had Ernie Colon, who was an editor, who's also a fabulous artist. Ernie was editing at DC in like about 82, somewhere around there. And he saw my samples and he said, "Hey, would you like to draw?" It's an 8 page backup I think it was going to be in Flash. It was a creeper. And I was like, "Hey,
Oh, I love the creeper.
well," I said, "just, hey, it's penciling. Yeah, I'll do it." And then I said, "But you know what? I would like to pencil and ink it. And I'm not sure how fast I can pencil to do a monthly deadline. So I agreed to do that, and then I called Len Wein up and I said I'm going to quit All Star Squadron because I'm going to get to pencil the backup the Creeper. And he shot back at me like without a second. I mean, it was really funny. Before I could, I just barely get it out of my mouth. He said, "Why don't you pencil All Star Squadron?" And I'm like, "There's a penciler on All Star Squadron. I don't want to get somebody kicked off a book." No, no, no,
Mm-hmm.
it's no problem. It's not. You're not going to get him kicked off. I have plenty of other work. I'll shift him over to this other book. And I'm like, well, okay. So then I had the problem of starting on a book, first time penciling on a book, and not really knowing if I could make a deadline because you have to draw 22 pages a month. It's
Yeah.
harder than, I mean, inking, it feels like a lot of the mental work, storytelling, and all that pacing and stuff is done. With penciling, that that's the big part of the job is not the drawing and the refining. It's mostly trying to break a plot into a manageable number of panels per page and get the story that the writer wanted. So it was a harder job, and but I jumped into it, and I wanted to make the change because I was still pretty young, and I think you can get used to the income. Like when you're inking, I could ink, maybe 25, 30 pages in a month, whereas the inker didn't get paid as much as the penciler. So I was like,
Mm-hmm.
gee, I don't want to get used to that money and not be able to then make a switch because I've got other obligations or a house or payments or whatever. So I did the switch and I never looked back on it. But, I worked with Roy then on All Star Squadron, and then Mike Macklin came in as an inker, and then Mike and Roy and I created Infinity Inc. and we did that. And by the time I was in Infinity Inc., I was kind of burnt out because DC had this like a Roy Thomas was in California, and Roy basically controlled by this point. After about 2 years, Len was no longer editing. Roy was editing and writing, so he controlled the Earth 2 stuff. And by virtue of being full time working with him, I never had any editors in New York ask me to do stuff. So I was kind of stuck just on that. And I always wanted to do Batman. I wanted to do other characters. So, I couldn't quit Roy in that way. So I made the jump because I kept getting offers from Marvel. I made the jump to ink John Byrne on Fantastic Four.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, okay, so Roy can't really get mad at me because I'm not going to another DC book. I'm just going to jump, and it actually felt like the right thing at the time and everything. And on top of it, DC was like giving me I was asking for a little bit more per page for penciling, and it was like, oh no, this is as much as we can give you. And the minute I went to talk to Marvel, and it was Mike Carlin who was editing the Fantastic Four, Mike said, "What's your rate?" And I told him, and he said, "Okay, we'll give you this plus, $3 more." So it was like
Yeah.
and again, Marvel sold better than DC. So, it was just kind of it was a good gesture, but it was funny at the same time. I forget what it was. It was like my penciling rate, I think I want to say it was like $90 at DC. And Mike Carlin was going to give me, he said, they have approved you for 99, but I'll give you 100. So
Wow.
and the minute I did this and switched over to Marvel, then DC is suddenly like, oh, wait, we're going to give you top rate. So then they started throwing, the top rate, and they trying to get me back. And I did a whole bunch of covers in that time, which is kind of funny. It was like
Yes.
around 1984. I did a bunch of covers for DC while I was, doing inks on Burn. And then partway through this, I get, would you be interested in, inking Crisis? And I was like, I still have these issues for Burn. I was into 8 issues. And oh no, it'll work out because you'll start Crisis on issue 6. You should be done with the Fantastic Four by then. And unfortunately, DC jumped the gun on it. And George, I guess, didn't like whatever inks he was getting. It wasn't from Dick. I think it was Mike DiCarlo, and he just didn't feel it. And that
Mm-hmm.
happens.
Sure.
So he really he wanted me, and it's like if I don't start with issue 5, then he was going to quit. That's how I'm hearing it from DC's point of view. I didn't hear that from George because I didn't know George at the time. So I'm just hearing this
Hmm.
from the DC production person. So it's like, oh my God, I don't want the guy to quit on this thing. So the month that I did Crisis 5, I also inked the last issue of Fantastic Four, but I also had to do a DC Presents annual that I got kind of roped into by Julie Schwartz, and you were never allowed to kind of bail on a project with Julie because he was a stickler for that. So he wouldn't let me out of it, even though DC is the one that put me in this predicament. If I didn't do Crisis, I would have had no problem doing that DC Presents annual. So DC is the one who threw it in there, and they wouldn't let me give me any any leeway there. So for 1 month, maybe a month and a half, I had my friend Al Vey was in a studio in Milwaukee with me, and Al really wasn't getting much work. So I said to Al, if you'll do backgrounds and finish, like erase the pages and then fill in the black areas or whatever, we have. I'm asking you right now if you're willing to work 7 days a week until we get this done. I said I'll order pizzas in. I'll pay for food or whatever. So we did that. We he and I showed up 7 days a week at the studio, and we worked from day till night, and we did pretty much. I think I wound up inking between just the main inks on these things. It was something like 5 or 6 pages a day, which is amazing for me. I was always like 2 pages was pretty much it. But so we got it done, and I spent most. I mean, like I said, with the Crisis, I couldn't pass off stuff to Al because it was a lot of figure work. So it really wasn't a lot of background to worry about, but it was like 8,000 figures on a page or whatever. And the same was true with Byrne. I mean, the Byrne stuff had a very tight and an organic feel. So Al did more like filling in blacks and erasing and stuff on those. But he did a lot of work on the DC Presents annual because that was something that was, it worked out for him in that sense. But we, somehow we got it done.
Well, this really points to the importance of the style of the inker and making the difference. That like Perez was like, oh, this guy isn't working. I want this other guy. Like, how do you establish your style as an inker? And there's definitely some inkers who I can just recognize like right away.
Mm-hmm.
And then like maybe Sienkiewicz or Klaus Jennison, and other people are a little bit more, they'll sort of reflect more of a different styles for different kinds of artists.
Well, I think that's partly to do with what type of inker they are. I mean, there's a lot of people who are really masterful technicians, but they're not necessarily people who can draw a lot. Like they're not somebody who, a lot of them probably could pencil, but maybe they don't have that confidence in penciling. So they're great for doing a smashing job on something that's really nicely penciled and already has style. So in other words, like if you were inking Alan Davis, for example, the end result is going to look like Alan Davis, but slicker, or however, you use your pens and stuff. So the guys that stand out tend to be guys who are, I mean, I say guys, it could be women as well, but people who would do maybe an extra percent of something and adding a little of their personality, their drawing into it. Like I said, Klaus Janson, Bill Sienkiewicz, when he's ink stuff, Bill just basically, it becomes like a really weird mix where you can still see the original penciler, but you see Bill all, because that's just Bill.
Yeah.
Bill he's like that in person too. I mean, Bill is just like a big personality. So, I mean, it all comes out. But Jansen, Tom Palmer, there's tons of good guys. One of the guys whose work I've liked for years is Dan Panosian. He does a lot of covers, but Dan has got a very distinct rendering style on top of his nice penciling. Is that his rendering, it comes down to whether you like pen work and whether you enjoy your tools and you're not just using them as a means to an end. Like a lot of people will try to ink a page to try to make it look really super realistic, whereas a lot of us like the idea of what those pen strokes look like. So the pen strokes become almost like stylized, in and of themselves, but they're not realistic, The best comics to me have always been like that, is that little element of stylization that kind of you can look at as a technician or as an artist, and you go, wow, look at the pen work, I mean, Walt Simonson's like that. Walt inks, when he inks his own stuff, you could ink him and still get Bob Wyacek, for example, ink Walt on a lot of stuff, and Bob was able to capture Walt's look. But when Walt inks himself, you can see that there's just a lot of interesting line work going on that isn't going to happen if somebody else inks you, because the same is true with me. I mean, when I pencil stuff for another inker, I would always tend to pencil it very tightly. When I'm going to ink it myself, I don't want it to be that tight because it would be
Right.
boring to me. So
Yeah.
I like to think of it as, being on the trapeze without a net. You try to get away with the least amount of tight noodling, rendering or anything in a pencil, so that you can actually discover it while you're inking it. But like I said,
Mhm.
when I'm doing it for somebody else to ink, then I'm going to draw it more tightly because I don't know who's going to ink it in a lot of cases. You don't always get that, like, people think, oh, you get to choose your colorist, you get to choose this and this. You really don't. I mean, in some cases you might, but generally, in my experience, I've always had to, I'd ask for somebody and I'd never get that person. And it doesn't always wind up being bad. Sometimes you find somebody new who does a great job on you, but it's, you tend to maybe pencil a little more defensively because you don't know.
Right.
I accused Ron Garney of this years ago. Ron Garney's another favorite of mine. I love Ron's stuff, and Ron did this when he was doing Justice League back in I guess maybe 2006, something like that. He had moved back, or he was at DC from Marvel, and I saw his pencils. And when I saw him in person, I said, Ron, I love the work. I said, but boy, you're trying to idiot proof that stuff, aren't you? And he's like, he
Mm.
just looked at me and he laughed because I could see it. I just, you try to create a style that doesn't leave a lot of leeway for somebody in case it's not somebody that is going to do a good job or somebody that you're going to like. So he created a style that really didn't rely on a lot of cross hatching or rendering in itself. So anybody could have kind of inked it, and as long as they followed the lines, it would look good.
I like the description though, defensive
It is.
drawing. I,
It's.
I, I totally get it.
I mean, some people. I know writers have done that. If they worked with somebody they didn't know who they're working with, uh, some writers would do that as well and try to either over-explain or, um, you know, try basically, oh, I know if I know I'm working with so and so, this guy's, either not going to finish the job or, I mean, everybody, we want to get the stuff done, but at the same time, you don't want somebody to screw up on it and bail out halfway through it either. So there's all kinds of little ways you can try to preserve your vision somehow, in adverse situations. But
Hmm.
I was going to say, you wanted to talk about Crisis.
Yeah.
Did you have any specifics, or just
Well,
want to riff?
there's the question of like, obviously there DC knew, it seems like they knew what they had in their hands when they were launching it because of the way that it was being promoted and structured. But you know, you were going and you're inking like George Perez, who's like crowd shot, everybody's in this picture. And you're the guy who has to go in with the details to actually get all of that
Right.
into what is already the most full of people, complex, composed crowd shot in the history of
Oh yeah.
mankind. So how do you navigate that with the pen?
Well, the hardest part, and again, this is something that I guess anybody who has inked George knows, is that George is probably the only guy in comics, even including Phil Jimenez, who likes to throw detail and figures and stuff. George is the only guy who can get as much story content on a given page. Nobody else can do that. And the way he does it is he goes microscopic. I mean, he goes and it's none of it's wasted. It's not like he'll do, a figure that could be like in Crisis, a good example. You might have a panel with maybe 25 figures that are about an inch tall, and each one of them would have costume details. And that inch tall drawing that you're inking is going to print at like maybe 5/8 of an inch tall, and is on bad printing, at the time, and color. So it's almost like a waste, except that it's there. And we both know, if he did it, I'm going to do it. Nobody's going to take shortcuts. So it was interesting because none of that was working towards the printing process that existed. That printing process was pretty terrible.
Yeah.
They were one of the lessons that you'd find out when you ink stuff in the pre-offset days was that these were presses. There were big, gigantic presses that had metal plates that transferred the image to the paper, and their paper was on giant rolls. They were created for the Sunday comics that the newspapers ran. So these machines dated back to the early part of the century. So they printed in a way that, because they were printed on metal, they put a coating of oil on the newsprint. As the newsprint ran through the rollers, a thin coating of oil went on the newsprint that kept, I guess, the paper from maybe sticking to the the plate, because it was a plate that had raised areas. In other words, an offset is a flat surface. Letterpress had raised areas, and those raised areas is where the ink line would get printed. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if you can imagine it
Yeah.
visually, but it would be like a white area or a non-color area would be just indented, and the color area would be raised a little bit. That's how the ink was transferred. So the presses would run as the books would come off the presses. If you had a high print run, by the end of the print run, the plate would be worn down, so all the lines would get thicker. So as an inker, you had to be aware of the fact that you couldn't use too fine of a line, but you couldn't use too thick of a line, because anything in between, it would generally flatten and widen everything you did. So you would put a lot of work into something, and you would see it printed and be like, whoa, what the hell? But you couldn't let that deter you, because ultimately your audience, in a way, was the people in the office, because that's where you got your jobs. So you always did a good job, and when it went to the printer, it was, everybody'd say a little Hail Mary and hope it looked good and hope everything. But that was the case with Crisis. So the first thing, when I got Crisis, they sent me it was the Flash in the beginning of the first issue. I think it was issue 5. It's like the Flash or was it the Flash? No, it was the Psycho Pirate and the Monitor, I think. In the beginning is, I think I don't have issue 5 with me.
I reread that issue for you.
But it's like a page or two of figures against the black. There's really no backgrounds in the first 2 pages or first couple pages. And those are the first ones I got. So I'm like, whoa, okay, I can handle this. I ink these pages, and then I get the next batch from George, and it's the double page spread with everybody in the DC universe on this double page spread. Everybody in the DC universe is on this thing. And I looked at that and went, I guess this is what I'm in for, And what I remember, I think I remember George telling me later, and maybe it was Len Wein, that they didn't want to send me that double spread first, because they figured I might quit because there was so much detail on it. And it's kind of funny to think about it, but that was the only time I also that I made a mistake in interpreting George, because I didn't know him. I just knew I would get pages. I'd get 2 pages in the FedEx. When I'd come to my studio, I'd have a FedEx package, 2 pages. I'd have to basically ink those 2 pages and put them in FedEx by that night, right? So that was my day's work, and FedEx deadline was, I think, 8:00 at night or something. So that was what life was like. Come in, see what you were doing, be done with those, mail them off, or FedEx them back to DC. So there wasn't a lot of navel gazing. You just had to sit down and do it. And again, you put a lot of work in. But on this double spread, George had drawn 2 characters, and it was printed on 2 pages, and it's got a split down the middle, two artboards taped together. And I'm looking at the grouping on one side and the other side, and I inked, I think, the left side or the right side first, and then I got to the left, however what our order was. But I went, there's 2 clay faces. And I thought, that's not good. And it was, deadline time, so I really didn't have time to call. It's not like you could call somebody and say, by the way, So I thought there were 2 clay faces, so I turned one of them into Tarantula from the All-Star Squadron. because I was looking at he's not in there. He's not represented. Everybody else is represented. So I had to look and make sure I didn't duplicate somebody. So I put
And you know your
Tarantula.
all-star squadron, so.
Yeah, so I put Tarantula in there, and then later on, George says, those weren't two clay faces. And I was like, oh. And he goes, yeah, one of them was Plasmus Plasmus,
Oh,
and the other. So
Plasmus.
I just went, oh well, sorry.
George is never wrong. So
Yeah.
there you are.
So and
That's
that was the thing. I
amazing.
mean, he did. I was being paid to do finishes, and what he did was kind of a cross. It was more than finishes, more than layouts, but less than full pencils. And all I asked of him, really, I said, was to make sure that you do the costume details, because if I have costume details, I can figure out which character this is, or I can look it up. But without
Mhm.
costume details, and I don't have a script, because he didn't have a script. By the time I joined that book by issue 5, he and Marv were discussing it over the phone, and George was working from that, and then Marv would dialogue what George
Right.
choreographed. So there was nothing to like look at the script and say panel 5. Well, there's nothing. I mean, nowadays everybody seems to write with a full script where it's got panel breakdowns and everything else, but plot style required you to break a story on your own. So you'd get like basically a big written, you know, 2-3 page thing, and you'd have to go through there and go, okay, this is one page, and you have to basically go through the whole thing and break it down yourself into digestible bites so that it could fit in 22 pages or whatever. But yeah, there was nothing to check. That was the big problem. So sometimes you had to I just had to have confidence that George knew what this was, and if it was something I couldn't reference, then generally I don't think we ran into any trouble. The only one that I remember visually that they changed, Guy Gardner originally had just a Green Lantern costume, and then somewhere in that, from the time George penciled it to where I got it within the space of a day or something, I think um, Joe Staten might have redesigned a costume for Guy
Oh,
Gardner,
yeah.
and
Right.
the classic turtleneck with the flap jacket
Yeah.
and all that. So I had to correct that as I inked it, but generally he was, again, I don't know how anybody could keep all of that in their head, but it seemed like he was the perfect guy, to do it. No one else could have penciled it, honestly. And that's, I have tons of respect for George, and I'm not just blowing smoke up his butt. It was like there really wasn't anybody else geared for that type of work, who could just add that much creativity to it. That's like a Jack Kirby, Stan Lee type production. You know what I'm saying? That
Hmm.
there's no printed script. It's a kind of a leap of faith between two people who hopefully are on the same page or what have you. But ultimately, that's why, to me, when I reread the whole series, I don't think the first 4 issues are very interesting. I know that you have a lot of setup, but I don't think they have a spark to them. And
Hmm.
I think by George, like, saying, let's just do this like we did Teen Titans, we'll talk it over, he'll make notes, and then he'll just, you know, lay it out. I think it created a more exciting visual, you know.
Hmm.
So I mean that project, again, I don't think you couldn't really recreate it, you know. You could have printed that book 60, you could have printed it from the original art. You could have done like a coffee table of that book,
Sure.
and it would have held up because the line quality was really good, and the just the amount of detail in there that I think got lost until they finally did a nice collection of it in the late 90s.
Hello, listeners. That concludes part one of our two-part interview with Jerry Ordway. His career in comics has been going 40 years strong, so there's a lot more to talk about. Stay tuned for the second part of our interview, where we'll discuss his work on Planetary, Tom Strong, and his most recent works with Neil Gaiman. Stay tuned for that.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games. you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.